Greetings and salutations. Welcome to a video about audio, and boy, I'm excited to be doing this one for you today. Get yourself a beverage, kick back, we're going to chat about one of the greatest phono cartridges ever made, the Stanton 680EL. And you probably have never heard of it at all. I have wanted one of these cartridges since 1986. The first time that I ever got to use one was back then at the high school radio station where I was learning to be on the radio and to be an engineer. And here I am. This is a picture from 1988, and I am sitting in the studio at WFOS, which was a real radio station, by the way. It was owned by the city of Chesapeake and run by the school system. And when school wasn't in and the students weren't in here running amok, the radio station actually had real employees on the air that took care of operations from 6 a.m. to midnight at that time. I would say about 80% of the programming you heard on WFOS in those days came from records. This was the 80s. CD was a new thing. Yes, we had CD players, and there's a couple of them stacked up over my head there. But we also had a very large record library. And the turntables in the main studio and in the main production room were identical. They were counter-mounted Technics SP25 turntables with Audio-Technica tone arms. And on those tone arms were Stanton 680EL cartridges. And this is where I fell in love with this cartridge, because I played an awful lot of records and made tapes that I took home of an awful lot of records that I still have and can go back and listen to. Even when I was out of record collecting for 17 years, did not have a turntable in my house. I had the tapes, and I remember listening to them and going, man, that sounded good. I would love to have one of those cartridges. And then I would think to myself, well, then I'd need a turntable, and then I'd have to go buy some records because I gave them all away. That didn't happen to me until 2010. That was my midlife crisis. But that's a story for another video. But in the back of my mind for all of these years, this has been the cartridge. This is the one that I compare all cartridges to. And for those of you who have followed this channel for many years, you know I have bought a lot of phono cartridges since I got back into the world of records and audiophilia. And this is a word I really like. If you're into phonography. Isn't that cool? It's a good word. So I bought this cartridge last week. It took a little while for it to get to me. And the funny thing is that during that time I went online and I was just reading up on it because I hadn't really put a lot of thought into it in many years. I have a bunch of Stanton literature. I had read through that, and I got to all of these audio forums, and I couldn't find a single person that said a bad thing about this cartridge. Nothing. Which is weird, because in the audio world, there's a lot of strong opinions, and people will debate you, which is part of what makes it fun as far as I'm concerned. But I couldn't find anybody who said, nah, it's a piece of garbage. Why would you want to play your records with that? No thanks. I mean, think about it. If you go and look up people's opinions about any modern cartridge, you can just pick one. Ortofon 2M Blue, for instance. There are some people out there who think it's the greatest thing in the world, and others are like, no, I don't like that cartridge. I fall into the category of not really liking it. I found it to be very distorted sounding and kind of like it was overloaded. And I don't like that sound, which is one of the reasons I really like this Stanton. But we'll get into that later on. So I couldn't find anybody anywhere that said anything nasty about it. I have posted on this channel extensively about Stanton 500 series cartridges. And this is my Stanton 500 Mark II cartridge. Now, this is a great phono cartridge. And the 500 series, they were in a lot of radio stations on the air from the 60s into the 70s, 80s, well into the 90s, early 2000s. They were kind of the radio standard cartridge. And they used to have a whole bunch of great styli that were available for them. I think the best stylus that you can get for a 500 is probably going to be the D5100. Now, the Mark II came with a D50 stylus, which tracks very light, anywhere between 1.5 and 2 grams. So that's kind of nice. The D5100, that's looking for about 3 grams. But sound-wise, I think the 5100 was the best. I have searched high and low over the last 5 or 6 years, actually longer than that, for a really good replacement stylus that will work on this body style of Stanton cartridge, and also the related Pickering cartridges as well. And I can't find one. Just cannot. The only stylus that I have that actually sounds any good is the original D50 that came with my Mark II, and I have bought a bunch of other styli and been very excited initially about the sound, and then would listen to it and I'd run across a lot of sibilants or whatever. And also going to the forums, I find that other Stanton 500 fans are having exactly the same problem. So I had pretty much given up on it. This is my Stanton 500 V3, and it's got a D71E stylus that I spent like an unbelievable amount of money on because they don't make these anymore, and I got it, and it sounded terrible. It was very high sibilance. I was disappointed. So I had kind of taken these and stuck them on the shelf, and I was like, I'm not going to mess around with this, because to be quite honest, the Stanton 500 at its absolute best is probably as good as, let's say, an Audio-Technica VM95 with the elliptical nude stylus, which I have one of. I've had a couple of them. And I like the sound of that cartridge. It's pretty straight up. And they're very similar in sound, actually, the 500s and that cartridge. So you have a modern equivalent, and it's easy to get styli for it. Why bother with it? That's where my head was at. And then last week, somebody sent me an email, and they were asking a question about a Pickering cartridge. Now, Stanton and Pickering are very much related. Actually, they're the same company. Stanton cartridges were directed toward professionals, anybody who needs to play a record for a living, radio stations, DJs, disco DJs, mobile DJs, people in libraries. That was where Stanton's market was. Pickering was more focused on the audiophile home market. So their cartridges are slightly different, but a lot of the styli are completely interchangeable. We'll talk more about that later in the video. But this person had asked me about a Pickering cartridge. So I went off looking for information about a replacement stylus for his cartridge. And this is when I came across this listing for a Stanton EL. And it was perfect. And it was new in the box. And I couldn't resist it, so I bought it. And so for a week, like I said, I was reading on forums. I was making sure that I could run it. I was looking to see if I needed to buy a head shell, all this other stuff, because they track a little heavier than your regular cartridge. The Stanton EL is looking to track at about 3 grams. And on modern turntables, 3 grams can be a bit of a challenge unless you get your head shell weight correct and all that other stuff. So I just wanted to make sure that I had my stuff together. And I have been just kind of kicking myself in the butt for buying this thing, simply because of the fact that I have had experiences with these Stanton cartridges that weren't necessarily wonderful. Like, here is a Stanton 681, which is very similar. The Stanton 681 was the top end of the Stanton line, and it was called a reference cartridge. Now, that's a word that I don't like in audio because, honestly, truthfully, there's not much reference in audio, but people will toss that around like, this is the reference. Well, your reference may be different than my reference, but anyway, that's an argument for another day. However, back in the 70s, when this cartridge was developed, the idea that Stanton had was to have a cartridge that would be calibrated at the factory to give the user an exact frequency response that would be on a test record. And they were designed for audiophile playback, and they were also designed for people who had to have a reference to work off of, people who cut records. So these guys were serious. I mean, they wanted it flat and they wanted it clean. And I bought one of these new old stock probably about 10 years ago, and when I got it, the output was really low. I mean, they only put out like 2.1 grams. Not grams. Millivolts. Sorry. We'll talk about grams later. And the other thing about it is that it was incredibly flat. And I just did not have the proper preamplifier to run this cartridge and make it sound good at that time. The other thing is that I also didn't have a turntable that was up to really letting this cartridge have a platform on which to show all of its little nuances of perfection. I think the turntable that I was using at that time was a really old Pioneer PL 518, which is a great turntable, but the one I had wasn't in such great condition. So I ended up putting this cartridge away, and actually I gave it to a friend a few years ago who still uses it to this day. Every now and again he'll put it on his VPI turntable and give it a spin. Let's talk a little bit about the 680AL cartridge and the EL cartridge, and what makes it different, and why I did jump at it, even though I've had all of these Stantons through the years, and I know it's hard to find styli. First of all, this thing just sounds wonderful. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. This is from the Stanton literature about this cartridge. I'm assuming that this is mid-80s right here. I'm not terribly sure about a date because it's hard to nail that down, but they kind of had the same stuff that they sent out for years and years and years. And this is what comes with the Stanton 680AL. They call it the Disco Duty cartridge. Disco, yeah, man. No. Well, I mean, it's made for radio stations, discos, and mobile DJs. And the idea here, and they call it the Stereo Standard series because it's a 680 series cartridge like the 681. The idea here is to have a rugged cartridge that you can abuse. You can back cue the record. You can basically beat the crap out of it, and it's still going to sound good. And that's one of the reasons you found them in radio stations, because they sounded good, and I can't think of a rougher environment on a phono cartridge than a radio station. And looking at the specifications here, it is flat from 20 hertz all the way up to 18 kilohertz. And the difference between 18 and 20 kilohertz, by the way, is about 2 dB. So, they were serious, I'm telling you. There's no peaks in here. As far as the output, it works out to be about 4 to 5 millivolts when you play back a standard level record. However, if you play back something that's really highly modulated, this cartridge will be louder. A lot of cartridges, when you play very highly modulated records like 12-inch singles, 45s, things like that, they'll turn to mud. For an LP, they sound just fine, but then when you have a really highly modulated record, 0 VU on a record, the standard level that the engineers shoot for, is 5 centimeters per second. So when you see the output on cartridges, it is referenced to 5 centimeters per second. So if you have 4 millivolts coming out of a cartridge, and that means at 5 centimeters per second at 1 kilohertz, like on a test record. That's how they would measure that. So remember that when records are recorded, there's a lot of EQ that goes into that. They de-emphasize the bass frequencies and emphasize the high frequencies, and your preamplifier has to fix that to get a flat frequency response. So a level measurement is at 1 kilohertz, which is right in the middle, and that's the flat spot in the curve. So this cartridge has a pretty high output, and if you go by their math here, it would be like 5 millivolts, but the truth is, I think it's a little less. 4.9, I've read that. It's all over the place, man. It's crazy. It depends on what you look at, even in their literature. So we'll just say between 4 and 5. How's that? Channel separation is listed as 30 dB. Now, on other Stanton cartridges in this series, like the 681 and the 500 Mark II, they'll list that as 35 dB. So I can tell you that it's every bit of 30 because I was listening with headphones most of yesterday and early this morning. You see, I should be working, not doing this video right now. But I'm so excited about this, I wanted to get it done. And then they have the other things here. The standard stylus that comes with this cartridge is the D6800EL, which is a 0.4 by 0.7 elliptical. That's a very mild elliptical shape. They also have the AL, which is a 0.7 mil stylus that is spherical in shape, and that would be pretty standard for playing all kinds of records. So let's see if there's anything else in here that jumps out at me. They have the AL specifications under the EL there. They're very similar. Not much difference there. Now the notes there, as far as tracking force is concerned, you'll notice, if you can see this, because if you're on a low resolution device, you might not be able to read this very well. Next to the tracking force, they say 2 to 5 grams. And then there's a note that says down here at the bottom, recommended by manufacturer for optimum performance. That's an awful wide range. These cartridges nominally track very well at 3 grams. And I've read that in other Stanton literature, and also that's kind of the story on the web. Most people say that if you run them at 3 grams, you get fine performance. And I know for a fact that back in the 80s at WFOS, that we were running them at about 3 grams. And so therefore I set up my stuff to run 3 grams. And it did not disappoint me sound-wise at all. Just did not. I just was blown away. This thing tracks as well as the cartridge that I just spent like an ungodly amount of money on. It's the AT. I got an AT VM540 with the microline stylus. I did a video about it, and actually I upgraded my VM530 to a 540. You just changed the stylus, but still I've got about $400 or $500 in that cartridge when you talk about the original cartridge and the 2 styli that I've bought for it. And this thing tracks better than that. And the other thing that it does, which I find amazing, is there's very little noise. There's no pops and clicks. Now, if you play a damaged record that has a scratch in it, you will hear it. But if the record is clean and you don't have, like on another turntable I would play it, you'd hear a little pop and a tick every now and again. You get used to that. This cartridge doesn't have that. And that has to have something to do with the coil arrangement. These are sometimes referred to as moving iron cartridges, which is the coil arrangement. It has 4 coils in it. I don't know how it works. There's not a great deal of information out there on the web about it, and so I can't really comment on it. I know that Nagaoka has the moving permalloy series, which is, they do have a moving iron version, which was the MP500, and that cartridge is $500 or $600. I have a friend of mine that has one of those cartridges, so I have a mental reference. I think this one sounds better than the MP500. Remember I said I wasn't going to buy any Stanton cartridges because I got burnt? Remember, why would I? This is why I did it, because new. I was like, this is the one. This sounds great. So these are different styli that are available for it. For those of you who are on those small resolution devices, let me tell you what we got here. The D6800AL is a 0.7 spherical. We've talked about that. Then we've got the 0.4 by 0.7 elliptical, and that is the EL stylus, so the D6800EL. And then we have accessory styli. We have the 6810, which is an LP stylus. Well, you think, okay, well, that's great. I can use that to play all my 12-inch records, right? No. When you see that, what they're talking about is the original LP standard before stereo, which requires a stylus that is 1 mil across. This is for mono records. I don't know. If a 1 mil stylus will actually hurt a stereo record or not. If anybody watching this has a comment on that, let me know. And then they talk about the patents here. So let's get out of here. This is what I saw on eBay, and it's the reason why I bought it. Is the person who listed it showed everything that came with it. This is a brand new cartridge. They opened just to check it. Finding Stanton styli is hard. Now, I am hoping that it's a little bit easier to buy styli for the 680 series. So if I should have to buy a new stylus, I know that there are some really high-end styli out there that perform as well or better than the original Stanton styli. But the truth of the matter is that I kind of doubt that, because this thing, I can't make it miss track. I have thrown everything I have at it. We're talking about 12-inch promo singles that are recorded at +6. Remember, I was talking about 0 VU being 5 centimeters per second velocity at 1 kilohertz. Well, if you double that, that's 6 dB above the 0. So those records are termed as saying that they were recorded at +6. A lot of 45s are recorded at +3. Your average 3 to 4 minute 45. If a 45 is much over 5 minutes, then the engineer will turn it down to 0, which it's 3 dB difference, okay? So you're not really going to notice that. Talking about an LP level there. And then if they want to really get long play on a record, they'll do -3. Like back in the 80s, we used to get a lot of radio shows on transcription discs, which are basically LPs. But one of the things about them is that they would be recorded lower volume so they could get more on a side, like a whole half hour. Those discs, because of that, we play them back with good cartridges, Stantons and Shores and things like that. But you really could only get 1 or 2 plays out of them, and then that noise would start to become annoying. Especially if they were mishandled. So if you ever come across those old transcription discs like American Top 40 or any of those kind of shows, be very careful with them, because they have very narrow grooves. They're recorded at low volumes. Those kind of records are really hard to keep clean anyway. They were never intended to be played over and over and over again. They were intended to be played once and thrown away. The instructions that used to come with Casey Kasem's American Top 40 when it came into the radio stations were, when you're done with it, throw it away. Of course, people didn't. They took it home or stored them somewhere or did something. That's why they're still around today. Thank God nobody did that. I mean, can you imagine that? You get these 4 records and it's the 4-hour radio show, and you just play it once and throw it in the trash. That's what they did, boys and girls. Serious. So when I saw how complete everything is, when you go to buy these cartridges, you have to have the hardware. The hardware is unique because the Stanton and Pickering cartridges have these little wings on top, and you have to have these little rubber things that go in it, and the screws go into that. It's a very good way to secure the cartridge, but it's a little bit wonky. And that means the cartridge is rubber isolated away from the head shell, which is really cool. Probably one of the reasons that these cartridges have such low static is that they are very well grounded as well. super well shielded. This is the box it comes in. Probably the reason why it has lasted, the one that I have, in such good condition for as long as it's been sitting on a shelf, is because they actually shipped it in a steel box. And that steel box would protect the cartridge from stray magnetic fields while it was in storage or being mailed. So sometimes you can get a cartridge used, one that's been sitting on a shelf for a while, and you like the channels are all out of balance or the audio's low. That's because the magnet itself has been affected by a stray magnetic field. That can happen. This one was just absolutely perfect. And did I not say it? Did you not notice in that last picture? Let me go back and show you again. The people at Stanton shipped this cartridge with an extra stylus. So I have 2 of them. Yes! Now, 2 styli on this cartridge will probably last me 10 years. As often as I play records. Because I play records in binges, I don't go in and listen to a record every day. And I got 2 turntables up and running, so I'm always going back and forth. I've got my Fluence turntable that has the, right now it's the Audio-Technica VM540ML cartridge on it. And then I've got my Audio-Technica turntable that has this cartridge on it. And this is the one that I would go for to play 45s, see, because the 540 ML cartridge, being that it is a microline stylus, that's not good for styrene 45s. Polystyrene records, people have told horror stories about how that really accelerates the record wear, so I don't do that. But with this cartridge, sure, no problem whatsoever. And here's a really good picture of the cartridge. You can tell this has never been used. So let's talk a little bit about these cartridges. This is a picture of a Pickering cartridge, which would have been somewhat contemporaneous. Is that the word? Is that a word? Somebody tell me. It would have been around about the same time. This would be the consumer version of the same cartridge, the 680, and it was the XV15 series. This is the DCF series of the XV15. This is about the same time. This would have been the 1980s, and they tracked at about 1.5 grams, and of course they had the brush on them. These are very good cartridges. I had a Pickering back when I was in high school. Actually, Dave Dessler, who was the engineer at WFOS, he came to me one day. He said, hey, because I had asked him at some point about the Stanton cartridges and how much they cost. And at that time, they were going for $150, which was way above my head. There was no way that I could get that. This was a time when you could go to Radio Shack and you could buy a Shure cartridge that they used to carry, like an RX-T6, which was really a good cartridge, or one of their light tracking P-mount universal cartridges, for instance, with a super elliptical stylus on it, like a 0.2 by 0.7. Those things sounded wonderful, and you could get one for like $40. So $150 for a cartridge was a lot of money, but he came to me and he said, look, I got this one and it doesn't really fit in with what we have around here. Would you like to have it? And I said, sure. So I took it home and put it on my original Pioneer PL518 turntable. It was wonderful. And back in those days, I didn't do my own turntable setup. He gave me the cartridge. I was able to wire it up, and then me and my dad rode down to the local sound shop, which was called Electronics Unlimited, and went in there and put the turntable on the counter and said, I need a new stylus and I need you to set this up for me. And he got out the stylus force gauge and set everything up, put the new stylus on it, and I paid the man and said, thank you. And then you took your turntable and you took it home and you didn't mess with it after that because you had it professionally set up. That's how we did it back then. And this is a good sounding cartridge, very similar. They continued to make Pickering cartridges. They later on they actually made Pickering DJ cartridges. I think that those were more popular in England, in Europe, than in the United States. And so you see those listed every now and again. And here's a picture of that cartridge, the Pickering. I bought one of those probably, I don't know, 5 years ago now. Maybe not quite that much. And did a video about it. And ended up giving this to a friend. I have given away so many cartridges through the years. It's unbelievable. A couple of times I just boxed up a whole bunch of them and sent them to people I know. Like I have a very good friend of mine named Laurent Roussel. He's a audio nut like I am. He's also the director of, I'm going to forget the school. I'm not going to get it right. You can look him up. But I believe it's Durham Tech in North Carolina. He's the director of the electronics program there. This guy knows his stuff. As a matter of fact, I've got a paper that he sent me that he wrote that I'm going to read, and I'm going to see if I can fashion that into a video and put it up here. It's all about audio cables, boys and girls. Laurent actually did studies to see if it makes a difference whether you pay $40 for a run of cable or $1,200. So we're going to get into that subject somewhere down the line. Anyway, I'm talking about the Pickering carts here because they're very similar. And the Stanton Styli for the 680 and the Pickering Styli are interchangeable. So that's good to know. Here's a Pickering TE1 cartridge running on my Technics turntable that I had some years ago. This was a Q200 quartz locked P-mount turntable. And so I bought one of these cartridges and did a video on it. Unfortunately, I never could get it to track quite right. And I don't think it was necessarily this cartridge's fault. I think it was the turntable itself. The tone arm was just never quite right on that particular turntable. So it went away because I couldn't, no matter what cartridge I put on it, I would always have sibilance in the left channel. And I think, like I said, it was something with the turntable, not the cartridges. But it still made for a wonderful picture, didn't it? So let me go ahead and conclude this. I just have been enthralled with this since I got it. I was so afraid that it was going to be another Stanton disappointment and that I was going to be like, oh my God, I spent this great deal of money for this cartridge, and I did spend nearly $200 on this. I will tell you that if you find these new old stock, they are not inexpensive these days. People are starting to get hip that the Stanton cartridges are wonderful and they're looking for them, and I almost feel bad putting up this video about them, to tell you the truth, because I'm going to make it worse. But if you want to buy one of these new old stock, you got to make sure that you actually see a lot of pictures. You want it to be very clean. You want it to be like the ones that are in this video. I just honestly believe that they have not made anything for under $500 in the last, I'd say, 15 years that comes anywhere close to what these cartridges are capable of. The sound of them is just unbelievable. And with headphones on, even though it's 40 years old and sat in a box, it beats the Audio-Technicas that I have just bought. And here's the main thing about it that I like about it to conclude. All of the cartridges that I hear these days, it doesn't matter who makes them, and you guys know if you follow my channel, I have had pretty much every below $500 cartridge that has been made in the last 10 years. I have tried out. And some of them sound really, really good, but all of them have their own signature sound, okay? So like my Audio-Technica VM540ML, it's a great sounding cartridge, but it's very bright. It has a lot of high frequencies. It's not so much that it's like shrill, where it becomes annoying, which happens with some of the other higher end AT cartridges, especially with the cheaper elliptical styli. But it is very clear on the high end, almost like what you would get from a CD. And back in the day, a lot of records were actually cut with extra high frequencies to make them sparkle, especially after CD came along, because the engineers were trying to make records compete sound-wise when people were playing them back with cheaper cartridges. Okay? And so if you play it back with something that has a little bit of an accentuated high frequency on it anyway, that just doubles it up. So after a while, that gets annoying. A cartridge that has a kind of a pumped up low end gets annoying after a while. Think like the Nagaoka MP110. I've heard some people say that certain examples of those cartridges have a very flabby bass, and it gets on their nerves. Not that the cartridge doesn't have great stereo and it tracks well and all this other stuff, and it also uses a 0.4 by 0.7 elliptical stylus shape, which is one that I really like the sound of. I've heard the Nagaoka on a couple of occasions. The first one I had was way too bassy, and the second one I had static issues. But those cartridges and anything like that that has a signature sound to it, after a while, can become annoying. The thing about Stanton was, Stanton over Pickering. Pickering's, I think, had more character from cartridge to cartridge. But the Stantons, the professional ones, they were always very flat. They were always in that perfect Goldilocks zone where it was going to play back to you what was on the record. And it wasn't going to be an interpretation of that. And you hear people talk about that they have a dim system, for instance, and dim would be not a whole lot of high frequencies. And so there are people that say, well, get a bright phono cartridge to compensate. I want everything to be flat all the way through. I want to hear what's going on. Now, getting back to that word reference before we wrap this completely up, I've never heard a microphone, which I have worked with many, many years, all kinds of different kinds of mics. As a matter of fact, I have two of them staring me right in the face. I have a Audio-Technica 2020 condenser mic that's hooked up to a DBX preamp and mic processor, and then I have a CAD microphone that I'm using to make this video that's plugged directly into the computer. It's a USB style mic. They sound vastly different. I've never heard two sets of speakers that sounded the same. I have never heard phono cartridges that sounded exactly the same. These guys at Stanton tried really hard to make a transducer that would be a reliable reference. And as near as I can tell, they were the only people who actually tried to do that, because you hear about how wonderful Shure cartridges are, and they are good. But Shure always has that warm, fuzzy thing going on. They have that slightly compressed mid-range. And if you like that sound, it's great. But for me, the Shure cartridges always got fatiguing after a while because of that sound. Even my most recent one, when I got an M105E, I noticed that. It's like, yes, this sounds very good, but it screamed Shure. It screamed it. It's just like, this is a Shure cartridge. Stantons aren't quite like that. When I listen to something with the Stantons, the 500 or the 680, it changes from record to record. And that's the way it ought to be. It ought to be what's on the record, not what the cartridge is doing. Because if you are listening to what the cartridge is doing, you're not paying attention to the music. You want something that's going to be like, oh, I want to hear this song. Now, granted, if you're watching this video, and if you've stayed around for this long, and I've been running my mouth for quite some time now, you're probably a fanatic like I am. And some people accuse us of being more interested in the equipment than the music. For me, it's always been 50-50. Some of my most profound musical experiences have been listening to a little clock radio on the bedside table, or hearing some distant AM radio station coming in from 1,000 miles away while on a lonely highway in the middle of the night. I have heard things that just shook me to my soul on really mediocre, low quality stuff. But then there's this other thing about, there's something really exhilarating about putting something together that you know is bringing you closer to that music because the sound is as accurate as you can get it, and maybe even expressing your idea of what it should sound like. So I'm not knocking anybody who wants to have a Nagaoka cartridge with a big low end and that warm sound. If that's what you like, great, knock yourself out. It's not like that at all. And if you like the Audio-Technica cartridges with their really crispy high end, that's great too. I want something in the middle. And for playing back my 45s and my old 60s and 70s stereo LPs, I can't think of anything better than this Stanton 680 EL cartridge. Nothing. So I'm going to live with this for a while. I may get another body if I can find one to put on a head shell to put on the Fluence turntable, because right now it's on the Audio-Technica. And I'm sure we'll be talking about it soon. And one more thing. How many? Have I said that 3 times now? I don't know. One more thing before we close out. There is a book about Stanton and Pickering that somebody has written. I have actually found posts from the author in different audio forums. I do not know the name of this book, and I cannot find the author's name. I would like to have a copy of it. If anybody knows anything about that, please leave a comment on this video. I would really like to be able to get a copy of that book because I am a Stanton Pickering fanatic. I guess we'll just go ahead and put it out there and say that's the way it is. These are my favorite phono cartridges ever, and this is my favorite example. It was better than I remembered it. Can you imagine that? 40 years, and it's better than you remember. Pretty cool, huh? Thank you for listening to this video. Thank you for watching. I do appreciate it. Comments and suggestions are always welcome. We'll have another Radio Stories video coming up soon. And at some point, I might do a video about Linux. We'll see. Talk to you again later.